Welcome back, everyone. How's everybody feeling so far? You're not overwhelmed with this wealth of information that's being presented? It's not too overwhelming? Hopefully not. We've got one of our most exciting and important panels coming up next. It's Activism and Education. It's really the most driving force behind any of the stuff that we're able to talk about and learn about today, because it's what's able to get into people's hearts and minds, and that's what's changing laws and changing people's opinions. So I want to just be able to get everybody's attention and welcome you back for our next program. That's going to be starting just in another couple of minutes. Activism and Education and the importance relating to our industry. We've got an incredible lineup of panelists I'm going to welcome. Starting with Mary and Joe and Mieko and Jules and Mike. We had our friend Kibra from Connecticut. Unfortunately, he was unable to join us, so Mike is going to fill in and provide a bit of an East Coast perspective of what we've got going on. So without further ado, I'd like to ask you guys to help me welcome the panel. Give them a round of applause. And without much more of a delay, we're also going to, with each program format, have a section at the end, a few minutes for some questions, if anybody has some. So throughout the panel, if some pop into mind, make sure you hold on to them for the end. We'll have a few minutes. And we're going to get things underway. Actually, I'll pass it off to Mary. Jules, you ready?
Yes.
She's ready.
Hello? Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, I think this is... Yeah. All right, everyone, thank you. No longer, this is Mary. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you all hanging out and sticking around for this last panel. Well, it's not the last one. It's the second to last panel, so stick around. But this is generally a topic where people start to tune out, so I really appreciate the people that are here willing to listen on how you can be active and why that's so important, and how you can continue helping to educate everyone in the world around you. This is really important that we continue that movement. We run into a situation all the time as activists where we meet people that say, "Oh, but it's legal already. It's going to be legal. We don't have to worry about it." And they take for granted that it's just going to happen, and it's not going to happen. I do remember, I've lived long enough in the 70s that I do remember a time when we thought it was going to be legal back then too, and then Ronald Reagan came along. Sorry, Joe. And that changed everything. So I want to make sure that everybody remembers that you can't get complacent, that when you get into pot, you get into politics whether you like it or not, and you have to stay active and you have to keep educating everyone. We have a lot of work left to do. So with that in mind, I want to introduce this amazing panel of people that have been working very hard for many years to bring us all here today. Because without the work that they're doing, none of you would probably even be here. So I want to start with all of you down the line. Tell me what you've been doing in cannabis and a little bit about yourself and why you got into it.
I guess that's me. I'm Joe Hunter. Good to see you all. As Mary just kind of referenced, I am a recovering Republican. I am an old guy who my first campaign was Abraham Lincoln's. I have no clue where he was on cannabis, by the way, other than I'm fairly sure he grew hemp. But seriously, I am a lifelong government political guy. I began working on Capitol Hill in 1981. I ended up as a chief of staff there. I worked in the Reagan administration, in the Bush 41 administration, and then ended up back on Capitol Hill for a number of years as a chief of staff. And how did I become interested in the cannabis industry? In, I believe it was 2010, I got a phone call from a guy named Gary Johnson, former governor of New Mexico, asking me if I would handle his media relations and issue advocacy stuff. Gary was a good friend of mine, and I agreed readily to do so. And of course, that cast me right in the middle of your business. I really am a libertarian at heart. I still am a registered Republican, I'm sorry. But hopefully today we'll talk a little bit about how to deal with people like me. Because sorry, we're in charge. But it really is a matter of freedom as far as I'm concerned. Personally, Mary talked about Nancy Reagan and Just Say No. I'm actually, as Mary knows, a recovering alcoholic, 26 years sober. I haven't touched anything since then. One of the first things I learned when I got sober was how screwed up Nancy Reagan was with Just Say No campaign. It obviously didn't work on me, so with that, I'll turn it over.
Hi, my name is Mieko-Perez. I'm an educational director for From the Earth dispensary, one of the largest dispensaries in Orange County, California. I started in this industry in 2009. My son was given 6 months to live with the medications associated with treating autism. I am one of the first parents to go public on national TV with treating their child diagnosed with autism. And now I do it internationally. I work in several countries. I work with hospitals. I now work in palliative care. And I work with patients on building an action plan for their health. So it's very important that I remain sitting on the Normal Women's Alliance, the California Minority Alliance, educational director, as well as a consultant for first-time patients and families. Until further federal laws are passed, special needs families need a voice, and I am that voice internationally.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is, I'm known here in Las Vegas as Ask Nurse Juhlzie. I learned of cannabis back in January of 2010. I am a registered nurse in the state of Nevada. I worked in pediatrics and ER medicine for many, many years, and I had no idea when I moved back here in 2005 that we even had a medical marijuana program in our state. And when I went home that day after a friend told me, hey, did you know that cannabis cures cancer? And I'm like, whoa, you can't be going around making claims like that. However, I went home and Googled, and it really opened Pandora's box for me. I learned that Nancy Reagan frickin' lied to me. Joe, I'm so mad at her. But the good news is, if I, a right-wing Republican from Orange County, California, who was raised in a Christian home, could actually now have saved my life utilizing cannabis. I'm a huge advocate, and I tell people, cannabis is my medicine, and it saved my life. And I am here on this stage because of this medicine. And if it's worked for me, and all these years, I was so excited about it, and the ER is like, Jules, we know you're really excited about this plant, that's cool, but sign this piece of paper, you're not supposed to be talking about it anymore, okay? And I'm like, but we have an answer to so many ailments. Why am I supposed to be quiet about this? And I slid it back over to them, and I told my manager in the ER that time, I said, I will be committing human genocide, knowing what I know, and signing this paper and not being able to talk about it. And that was the decision when I knew I had to utilize cannabis as my first line of defense. It's my go-to med. I juice every day. I love it. I love cannabis. People are like, a lot of my friends from way back when are like, God, what, you? Yeah, me. So as a nurse, I knew we had to get the knowledge out there, so I started Cannabis Nurses Magazine, and that was in October of 2015. It's done extremely well. In the last 2 years, just in Colorado for some of the Cannabis Business Awards, we won the Educational Achievement Award in 2010, and we're really, really proud of that. I mean, we went up against people like Sue Sicily and and Dustin Dingman, all these wonderful activists and educators, and I'm just really proud to be able to be there to put good evidence-based education out there. And from there, I now work with the nurses at a national and global level, and we started Cannabis Nurses Network. We had our very, very first cannabis conference here in Nevada this last October. We held our courses at UNLV, epic. Students for Sensible Drug Policy and Normal. I know Normal's out here today. Thank you so much. We actually promoted them and kind of went in the back door for that. And we couldn't hold an award ceremony anywhere because of the Gaming Institute and kept getting the doors slammed on our face. So we were told that our conference wasn't going to happen. And I said, well, it's going to happen. They just don't know it yet because they don't know about it yet. So we literally, our conference members, we went and talked to Metro. We talked to the head people to let them know we are here to educate. We're not here to consume. We also talked to the county commissioners in the city, and they came behind us, and we ended up having our award ceremony at City of Las Vegas in their lobby. And it was amazing. And because of the work that we did back then in August and September, and we held our conference and we were successful, MJ Biz was able to come through. We got Vegas Cannabis Summit here. Otherwise, the doors would have been shut in our face. So I've been an advocate, but now I'm also a major educator. So thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Mike Z. I'm the founder of an organization called High NY. We're New York's largest cannabis meetup group and one of the largest in the world. Since 2014, I've been organizing nearly monthly education and networking events on a variety of cannabis issues. I'm proud to say I've helped educate thousands of people on the East Coast and have had the opportunity to write this book, The Entrepreneur's Guide to Cannabis, where I interviewed a bunch of industry leaders much more experienced and wiser than myself and have put their advice together for entrepreneurs. And I am currently a contributor to Forbes.com on cannabis business topics. And it's an honor to sit on this panel with these folks who, as an activist who feels a little uncomfortable calling himself an activist because, compared to these folks, I feel like I have a lot to go to earn my activist title. It's really an honor to be here, and I would encourage everyone in this audience. Clearly, you're here for a reason. You're passionate and interested. Consider yourself an educator and activist. Give yourself permission to be that person, because there is just such a tremendous need for education and for activism. And I think this is truly the most important topic that will cover this whole event, because without activism and education, there is no industry, no access to medicine, nothing else. So I'm grateful to all these folks and for all of you for being here and for having this opportunity. And I just wanted to invite Mary to introduce herself, because I don't think you did. So.
Right.
Well, I'm a second-generation activist. I grew up in a home of activists that grew cannabis and taught me everything about cannabis there was to know before I was even old enough to drive. But I think that because it was so accepted in my home, I didn't have that passion for it in the beginning. It was just something just like everything else that children weren't supposed to do, like drinking or smoking cigarettes or driving a car. At a certain point, I did realize, though, that one of the things that this was a little different than everything else, that it could actually put my parents in jail, and it scared me when I was a teenager to think that, wow, my parents could go to jail for this. My uncle, who was the first patient I ever knew, could go to jail for this. So I became an activist when I was a teenager, realizing that. But, it was a part-time passion. I never thought it could be a career. I went on and had a life and a career, but always stayed very involved in activism until about 2009 is when I went to go work for the Marijuana Policy Project. I left my job in a very great job that I loved, but just felt so compelled because, family members were dying of cancer, and this issue has still not been resolved. So I decided to devote my life to it at that point, full time. But getting back to activism versus entrepreneurship, let's say, I would say that back then, there wasn't really a pathway to having a legal career in the cannabis industry, so it wasn't anything we ever thought of as a job, unless you wanted to, sell dime bags or something, which was not going to be what I was going to do. So most of the people that we knew back then that were activists, there wasn't a career, it was a calling. And I feel that each person that comes to this industry now still has sort of a calling that drives them, that makes them want to put everything in their past and their future on hold, because they know, I remember when I first was deciding to take a job in the cannabis industry, I thought I was going to put sort of a scarlet letter on myself, that I'd never be able to get hired in a real job again after this, so it had to work. I was like making that leap. So I'd like to hear from all of you as well, because I'm sure Mieko and, I don't think you thought of this as a career opportunity when you started off as an activist. And here you are now, you've been able to transition into making it part of your career. And so have you, and so have you. And even Joe, who I always say, I started in the Reagan era as an activist at the time when you were in the Reagan White House, working for an administration that said it was the most dangerous drug known to man. So it's fun now to see that we're on the same team. But back then, I'd really like to hear how you are able to take what was an activist position and turn it into a career. Because I think that there's a lot of people here that want to also learn how to do both.
Well, first of all, to be fair, I to a much lesser extent than everyone else on the panel, I can't really say that I have a career in cannabis. It really was somewhat thrust upon me when I began working with Gary Johnson. But it was an easy thing for me to do. And because, as I said, I'm a libertarian at heart. So really what drives me is not so much a particular industry like cannabis, but just the overall notion of freedom and getting the government out of people's lives. That's my passion, and that's what I work on. And right now, cannabis is Exhibit A in government insanity in terms of telling people what they can or cannot do. So that's, and I will tell you, for my own personal career purposes, I'm a political consultant, a lobbyist, an advocate. I work for oil companies, I work for charitable foundations, I work for all kinds of different people. And I will say that having worked with Governor Johnson and being out publicly talking about cannabis, it has cost me a lot of money. I happen to live in Utah because I like to ski a lot. I can't get a client in Utah, and haven't tried for 10 years because I'm that Gary Johnson libertarian pot guy, even though I haven't touched a joint since I was in college. So
You're endocannabinoid deficient there, Joe.
don't get me started.
Just really kind of adding to that it does become a problem, because once you decide to step into that arena, it does impact your prior career or the career that you're existing in. I'm sure you're experiencing that right now, Mieko, isn't that right?
Right. I've been a legal secretary for 15 years, over 15 years. And with autism being 1 out of 25 homes in America, there was no way that I was going to turn my back on the autism community, the special needs community. And so I had to figure it out. The day that I walked off of Good Morning America, I had the entire world contacting me, asking me how, why, and when, and how do I do this? And I also had the healthcare community as well. So I created my job. I had to reinvent who I was, reinvent my career. And, 10 years later, and now I'm working with hospitals and I'm working in palliative care. My son's diagnosed with autism, but in late 2011, he was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is a fatal muscular dystrophy. So here I am with the golden child. He has autism and he has Duchenne muscular dystrophy. There's no cure for either one. But 9 years later, and he's still alive, and he happens to be one of the most productive hospice palliative care patients ever. And because of that, now I've walked from autism to palliative care, providing hope in hospitals and providing hope to cancer patients. And I'm very, very thankful for cannabis. It has not only given me life, but it's given everyone else life as well. And so every day that I wake up and see Joey, I'm reminded of what I'm doing and giving back to the community and giving back to life. Cannabis has been able to provide life extension, and you'll never forget it. For me, it's once you save one life, it becomes contagious. And that's what keeps me going every day, and it keeps me fighting for families, not just here, but all over the world. So, cannabis has given me a lot more than I can ever give back. So I'll have this job till I die.
Well, and for me, it was very interesting because I'm like, oh, we got cannabis, this is great. How do we get it to the people? And they're like, well, you gotta go behind the stratosphere and over there. And I'm like, I can't be sending my stage 4 cancer patient, grandma, down back here to get meds. So we didn't have safe access. And I was a patient at the time, and I was healing and utilizing a lot of cannabis. I had been in many motor vehicle accidents. I have degenerative disc disease, herniated discs, spinal stenosis, neuropathy, you name it, and nerve pain is one of the worst pains. So it's allowed me to be able to function and get off of all the normal pharmaceuticals, and they pretty much left me couch locked, and I didn't have any quality of life with my children. It was hard. And as I healed myself, I'm like, well then we gotta somehow get this to the people. So I know Cindy Brown, I know you're out there, Rick Brown. There's a lot of us in this community. There's a handful of us, I say 5 of us, that really pushed hard back in 2010. And we went to our legislators, we went to Senator Tick Seegerboim, and we're like, hey, we've got a problem. We need your help. We want to make sure that medical stays here. You guys can have your recreational and tax the heck out of it. But I always see consumers, I don't care if you're a patient, if you're an adult use or recreational use, all cannabis use is for a medical benefit, whether you know it or not. And a lot of people self-medicate with that. So being an activist all these years, I look back now, 7 years, we have dispensaries, we have our safe access, we have safe products because we made sure we got testing in the state, and it's still been a trial. And the next thing we're working on is having safe consumption, okay? Because if you can walk down the street right now and with your open container and your cigarettes, but you can't have a joint or consume vape pens or anything like that in the culture, and you want to treat it as an equality to alcohol, we're having some double standards. And so education, I felt, was the best place for me to transition into. And I always say, if you're looking at becoming an activist, stay in your lane. What is your expertise that you're doing right now in the real world? And how can you incorporate that knowledge into education? And that's exactly what I have done as a nurse. We now have Cannabis Nurses Network. We educate nurses all over the country and globe. And we feel as if we can educate one nurse at a time, that nurse then goes to talk to doctors, talks to patients, talks to parents, talks to their community members. And we're the #1 most trusted healthcare professional in the Gallup polls for the last 20 plus years. Although 9/11, we did give it to the firemen, so thank you, firemen. But nurses do take that as being the most trusted, and that is a magnificent discovery in my realm of nursing, is that when we do educate our nurses, we are making a difference. We are stepping out of the box. We need to make sure we're charting, oh my gosh, cannabis is your medicine, then it's cannabis. It's not. There's a lot of diagnoses codes and things like that that have been ingrained from the Reagan era that we really have to work on. That's a whole nother, I didn't become a lawyer, but I am a medical provider, so we'll leave it up to you, Joe. But education is the key to changing the stigmas that we have had in our society for 80 plus years. And let me tell you folks, the reefer madness we had in the 1930s, I'll go up against Harry any day, but some of this new, it's like reefer madness on steroids, some of the materials that comes out now. So making sure we put good information out there to the people is vital, and that's what I do.
So how did I end up here? Is that the question, right? Activism, yes. So it was an accident in some ways where I had gone kind of through the traditional path of, go to college, get a job, and I was very fortunate that I was a good student. I got a good corporate job at JP Morgan where I was absolutely miserable, and I was even more fortunate to get a job at Google, and I was working there, and I was a consumer, near daily consumer that whole entire time. I was still a high performer and got promoted and all that good stuff. And after a while, I just really felt unfulfilled in my work and what was I doing with my life? And I was living in San Francisco, working in Google headquarters, and one day I had a freak accident where I had a traumatic nerve injury in my arm, and it led me to be bedridden for a couple of months and couldn't really care for myself, and I had to move back to the East Coast and recover and then get back into the working world. And when I got back to work, I was doing the tech startup thing again, and I was just like, boy, this is not what I was put on this earth to do. This is not, I'm not getting anything out of this for my spirit. And so I quit that and I started my own business doing life coaching, which had been something that's really, I'd been passionate about, and, helping people find their passion and make more of their time and energy. And I started going to all these networking events. And one day I went to a cannabis event in New York, and it was the first time I had met true activists and true medical patients and people who had gotten their lives ruined by criminal records and low-level offenses. And I had been a consumer for maybe, 6, 7, 8 years by then, and didn't know anything, literally anything about the history of the plant, the community, the politics, the science. And meeting those folks that evening was like my big come to Jesus aha moment where, all the privilege and ignorance that I had been living under had been penetrated with fact. And I realized, I was like, wait a second, this is the thing that I'm gonna commit the rest of my life to. Because it was such a no-brainer for me that, the economic impact, the social impact, the environmental impact. Once I had learned all of that stuff, I couldn't I couldn't even consume the plant anymore without feeling guilty, because I felt like, here's this plant that's given me, so much joy, so many of my close personal relationships, so much pain relief, so many great things, and I had done nothing for it, and I felt like a free rider, which I was an econ major, so like for me it was like, how do we have this renewable resource that offers so much utility, and we're actually, instead of using it for good, we're using it for evil, and like that completely pissed me off. And so that was kind of the calling moment for me where I realized like, oh shit, this is what I need to be doing. As far as actually turning that into a career, you know, that is much more complicated, I would say, and I would still say it's a work in progress 4 years later. But one thing that I'm really big on, and I mentioned this in the book, is that you can't have a career in cannabis, you can't be an entrepreneur in cannabis and be successful if you're not an activist first. And if you don't start with that activist spirit, you know, the folks that have been doing it and the folks that are the influencers and have the legacy knowledge or whatever you want to call it, like the people who matter in this community often will not embrace you if you can't demonstrate some kind of commitment to activism. And, you know, actually funny, like last time they had this conference, I remember one of the panels was a bunch of folks who manage and run dispensaries here, and they all said, you know, if I see a candidate's resume has some activism on it, you know, they have a leg up. You know, if they volunteered at Normal or if they work with any of the local organizations, they have a leg up. So I really think actually activism is a competitive advantage for someone who's trying to work in this space. As far as what activism is for you or how you contribute to that, you know, I'd say, to your point, do what you're good at. There's some organization that needs your help. There's some business leader or community leader that needs your help. If you have some kind of professional skill set and time and energy to offer. And, you know, in my personal experience, like I had zero interest in government and politics and policy. Like cannabis was my gateway into civic engagement. Otherwise, I would have stayed away from it forever. Like, I don't like it still, but it's a necessary evil. But, you know, my thing was bringing people together. And, you know, 4 years ago in New York, like, people were scared to even publicly admit to being consumers or supporters, and yet they wanted to, you know, bring industry there. And they were saying, well, why aren't we like the West Coast? And, well, if you're scared to even talk about it or be public about it, then, you know, we have no community. So my activism was, you know, I could create a space and bring people together and reach out to folks to come educate and, you know, share the wisdom and knowledge and those facts that, you know, people like facts.
Well, and it's not just facts, it's actual true research. And one point I want to bring up, because I am an educator, there's 3 governmental studies that our government did that we don't even know about, and that it says that that cannabis aids as a neuroprotectant, an anti-inflammatory, and there we go, my memory. Help me out, everyone. There we go. Well, it's
Antioxidant.
Antioxidant. Thank you very much. Cannabis is one of my side effects, so I do sometimes have a lapse, but that's what our colleagues are for. And to mention also that we have a patent that the government owns, yet they still stick it in the Schedule 1. And it's just, when I first came into cannabis, I go, oh, well, it's a very simple solution, everyone. You just change it out of Schedule 1 to a descheduling. Well, it's not deschedule, it's a herb. And we'll get all the laws changed, and we can get research and be done. And they're like, oh, dear darling Jules, you have a lot to learn. We've been doing this for 80 years. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I knew that education would be the mecca to be able to get the wheel and the cog rolling. And you two over here on the end, Mary and Joe, you guys have been at this for a very long time. You're talking about the 70s. I was born in 1970. So I'm that other generation now that we can come in and help encourage this along. Because it takes all of us. And it just takes that one voice, just one voice, to ask that question. Can cannabis really help with X, Y, or Z?
Well, you know, I always say that when I started as an activist, they used to say, "You're crazy. You're never going to get marijuana legal," because it was the 80s. It was Reagan era. And I said, I think you have to be a little bit crazy to think you can change the world, because you're just crazy enough to believe that you can. So we stuck with it, and whether or not we were going to turn this into a job was really not the issue. What's exciting now, though, is that most of the people that I started with in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, they are some very, very desirable people in the industry that people want to work with. As Neil and Tim were talking about on the last panel, that, the people that can find the best opportunities are the people that learn the regulations in and out, because you will find a lot of people that need to understand, how do I get a permit? How can I operate? What's legal, what's not? And if I can't even count how many times a day I get a phone call about, like, how can I do this? How do I get in? And I usually just want to say, just read the regulations, but most people don't even want to do that. They'd rather have me read it to them or for them, I suppose. But it makes me valuable, because I can help people obtain their permits and operate legally in this industry. So that's why I'm an industry consultant, because I can read regulations, but not only that, I get involved in the writing of the regulations as they're occurring. So you can change the language in your city, in your county, in your state. We're still working on federal, but that's something that we're gonna have to work on for a while, I think. But then keep your network strong. If it weren't for the fact that I could call people in, political insiders, as I call them, to ask them questions of, what do I do about the fact that Jeff Sessions is now saying this or that? And then I call Joe, and I say, is this going to be a problem for us, and how do we deal with that? Because I'm not a Republican, and I don't know how to speak Republican, so help me out here. So, and that kind of information is really, really important. If you can learn how to speak Republican right now, it'll be really helpful. So that's why you want to talk to people that might not agree with you politically, but you want to learn how to work with them to get things done. So Joe, if you could actually speak to that a little bit, I'm sure that this is an issue that's crossed people's minds over and over again. Do we have to worry about Jeff Sessions? And, what can we do, if anything, about an administration that openly says they want to take us down?
Well, first of all, I really wish I knew what it is that happened to Jeff Sessions when he was a kid or something that made him the way he is.
He needs some cannabis.
About cannabis. I mean, I've actually known Jeff Sessions for many years. I know his family. The good news is, first of all, let's talk about, do we need to worry about Jeff Sessions? Yes, he's the Attorney General. Tomorrow he could show up on each and every one of your doorsteps. The kind of political process question would be, will anyone in the White House step in and stop it? The way, a little bit of inside baseball, the way administrations work, and they all have some variation of this process, is the cabinet secretary, like the Attorney General, is given amazing latitude to do what he or she wants to do. The people in the White House, the president and his staff, they don't have time to worry about every little thing that these guys are doing. So typically what will happen is the White House will identify for the Department of Justice or the Department of Interior or whomever and say, okay, if it's about this issue or this issue or this issue, don't do anything stupid. Come talk to us before you do anything. And interestingly, almost no one knows this, but the actual key piece of the process is the Office of Management and Budget, because any regulation, anything like that, has to go through that agency. And interestingly, no one at the Office of Management and Budget has to be confirmed by the Senate. They work directly for the president. They're fairly immune from politics. So that's the really dangerous place in DC. And we have kind of a dangerous guy there. But having said that, Jeff Sessions, the things he's said and done so far relating to cannabis, he has done without the blessing or without the veto of the White House. Now, I can tell you, I have friends working in the White House. I have former colleagues working in the White House. And the good news is, in the White House, they really don't care about this issue. In other words, they do not share Jeff Sessions' fanaticism about it. But having said that, do you have to worry about him? Yes. There are probably a lot of people in this room who know this better than I, but I have a couple of clients. On the afternoon when Jeff Sessions basically tore up the Cole memo, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in valuation were lost, at least for a few hours. Now, people like Mary were calling people like me, and those phone calls were happening all over the country, and most people like me were saying, oh, he's just nuts, don't worry too much about it. So a lot of that valuation came back on Monday. But that tells you, you've got to worry about it. So what do you do about all that? I don't want to take up too much time, but it really does come down to activism. But the one thing I would offer in terms of speaking Republican is, and I speak to a lot of groups like you, and I talk about this issue a lot, and I probably irritate some people when I say, you've got to realize, most of the movers and shakers in the industry, people like Mary, all of people and many of you out there who have gotten us to where we are now, it's been a movement, okay? You're now an industry. Step one is start acting like an industry instead of a movement. Because the politicians that you've got to deal with, they really don't like your movement. But they really like $20 billion industries. And they like business people, and they like professionals that they can deal with. So you got to put your big boy pants on and go play their game. And I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. That's step one. Two, in speaking Republican, I got to tell you quickly, and I'm sorry, a funny story. I live in Utah. Literally today, as we're here, they're debating medical marijuana in the state legislature in Utah. Now, the reason they're debating it is because it's on the ballot in November and it's going to pass. So these guys are crapping in their pants trying to pass something in the meantime. But the most Republican place on the planet, the most Mormon place on the planet. And they're having this conversation in the legislature. What cracks me up as a Republican and as a guy who makes his living dealing with Republicans and getting Republicans elected, I'm sorry, is I literally yesterday watched state legislators make the argument that, well, we can't legalize cannabis because it's against the law. It's against the federal law. These are the same people who appropriated $5 million to sue the federal government, claiming that the government doesn't really own Zion National Park. These are the same people who several years ago, God love them, passed an immigration law that said illegal immigrants can come to Utah, that's fine, and we'll try to keep the feds from arresting you. Can anybody spell hypocrisy? This makes no sense. So how do you speak Republican? You go to them and you call them out on it. You're like, wait a second, guys. The opposition from Jeff Sessions hadn't stopped you before. Why stop you now? That puts that argument to rest, and frankly, it did put the argument to rest. So, and in all due respect to the folks on up here, in dealing with the Jeff Sessions and the Donald Trumps of the world, etc., if you fall into the trap of debating the merits of marijuana, you're not going to win with Republicans. You're not. What's the argument you want to have? The argument you want to have with Republicans is this any of your damn business? That's the argument to have. When you go into a member of Congress or at the White House or a state legislator, I do this for a living. Figure out what it is you can walk in the door and agree with them on, and that they can agree with you on, and start there. With Republicans and the people you're dealing with, the problem out there, what you can agree with is that the federal government is bad, and they don't do anything very well. And I don't care whether marijuana is good or bad, but I don't like the idea of the IRS coming after me. You know, every Republican in the country will agree with that. So that's the conversation to have. And I could go on for hours and hours and hours, and happy to talk to any of you, but
So when I think about just, educating people, we need to educate legislators. And,
Absolutely.
I always say all the politicians that I've ever known that really kind of came around because somebody in their family started to suffer and they felt it and saw it firsthand. So, and I've heard a rumor that also might be the case with Donald Trump. I don't know for a fact,
oh,
but
it
I've
is
heard.
true. It's not a rumor.
So was it a
I
brother?
think it was a brother, yeah.
Right. So that's why nurses and people like you are so important to the educational process, because somebody might be related to the people that we need to influence in Washington. That's usually when they come around.
Well, and it's interesting you say that. I've had different levels of government. Their families will come to me and say, hey, I've got X patient, would you mind consulting with them? And it's amazing because these are real people that are really writing some of our legislation, and it's finally affecting them. Okay, it might be their grandmother, their spouse, their child, themselves, their neighbor, their church member, their colleague. It could be a variety of things. And I never studied politics. I hated poli-sci. I took my C+ and went on my way. But what I didn't realize is getting involved as educating. We ended up taking, through Cannabis Nurses magazine, we did an issue on the March-April edition on opiate addiction. And this was a huge topic in our legislative process this last year. It had the roadmap for one of our nurses from New Mexico who went to their legislation to allow cannabis to be added as an opiate addiction as one of the conditions, and had all the research right there. So it's kind of like your little Bible. You just hand it over to your legislator, submit that in for record. They tried to not have it be entered. It was really frustrating because well, this is copyrighted material. And I said, well, I'm the owner of it and you have my permission, publish it. So we went through some little tricks that, that they do. But I really do try and stay in my lane. But unfortunately, sometimes we have to go and talk to our legislators and get involved and let them know somehow. You're very right, Joe, with making that heart connection. And that's really where it is.
Just a quick note, two things. Again, I'll refer back to Utah because it's ground zero. If you can, I have a $100 bet with Gary Johnson that Utah will not be the last state to pass medical marijuana. I think I'm going to win. But early on, when we put an initiative that is on the ballot in November in Utah, they came to me and said, they being the advocates, the groups who were sponsoring it, and to talk about the messaging. And I said the messaging is really very simple. And no offense to the mothers up here, I said, I don't want to see anything in this campaign but Mormon moms. Nothing. I don't want to hear about anybody. Now, they did throw in...
And you have some up there, Joe.
There are some great ones. Believe me, there are some great ones. And they did throw in a Mormon software engineer who had to leave Utah and go work somewhere else because of his medical condition. The point being, you've got to personalize it. And the other point I would make with Republicans, and everyone, another way to personalize it on the adult use side is talk about the lives that have been ruined by prohibition. That resonates with Republicans. I'm going to the I'm embarrassed to say this, the Conservative Political Action Committee conference in DC next week. And the reason I'm going is for discussions about criminal justice reform. It's all about how many lives have been destroyed by prohibition. And we have yet to find the life that's been destroyed by cannabis. Remember, 130 million Americans have used pot at some point in their lives. Don't forget that.
Well, I will say this. There's a lot of different pathways to try to get the government to do what we want. We obviously need to educate them on lives and how it costs us money in taxes, how it saves people's lives for health. But I would say this. If I had to put my finger on one thing that was the most important thing that you do in your day to try to influence a politician or to make a difference, is there one piece of advice or one thing that you've done that has been the most effective thing that you've done to make a difference? Okay, maybe
I'm not
no.
going first this time.
That would.
Wow. I intervene in child protective service cases
That's awesome.
24 hours a day. Until further federal laws are passed, special needs families, we have a choice. And sometimes we do not have physicians that are in our favor with this treatment option. So therefore, I find myself helping social services and vetting out families. We are already dealing with the dynamics of having a special needs child. Now we have investigations and people coming into our home to add more grief. So I'm available 24 hours a day for legal counsel and social services in the United States. And that's how I give back.
That's awesome, you guys. Because as a registered nurse, there's cases sometimes in the PDR that we come across. Doctors literally come to us as the nurses for official advice and say, well, what do you think about this family? Do we need to have CPS intervene? And that's a huge obligation. Huge.
Cases need to be closed in 72 hours.
Yep.
So whether I'm driving my son to school or driving myself to the dispensary, wherever I am, when legal counsel calls, I act because I know how important that is and how important it is to keep a special needs family together. I live it every day.
I will say the most important thing I do is raise money. Raise money, raise money, raise money. And I raise it in many, many ways. I mean, you can raise it in a fun way by throwing a fundraiser benefit, or just do pools, give back a portion of your sales if you're a business owner. But I think that the stories are very important, the arguments are very important, but there has been nothing more important than dollars. That's my experience. Anyone else?
That's what this industry is about. I always say there's two heads to cannabis. Cannabis is a Latin root for a two-headed dog. There's the humanitarian side of it that gives back to us in the plant, but there's also that greed and monetary side of it that some people get into the industry because they're going to make a buck. And that's cool. We want you to make money. But this plant is a healing plant and was put on this planet for all humans to be able to consume. No law should be able to keep that from any human. And I always tell my legislators, I said, guys, I love you, but the science just has not, or the laws haven't caught up with the science of the plant. We have old, outdated laws that have been there forever, and they need our assistance. We need to step in. And one of the things I did was I just consumed myself with legislative meetings and city council meetings and went to help start up the patient-to-patient groups and some of the We Can and all the different organizations that are out there, and NORML and Students for Sensible Drug Policy and MPP and Americans for Safe Access, you name it, they're out there. Indulge yourself, educate yourself. All these senators can figure out, well, why does this nurse keep hanging around? What the hell is she doing? Well, I was doing my field research. folks. I knew that law. NRS 453A, if you don't know it in the state of Nevada, you better know it by the back of your hand. Because that's the Bible. That's our law, which we're governed under. So what do we need to do to make those changes?
I would say, I think for me, the most important thing that I've done is empower other individuals to become activists, especially getting started in New York where, again, there wasn't an active community. I think, I was able to disregard the reputation risk that so many out there perceived and show people that actually you can be vocal about this issue and still be a respectable human being, and also created the opportunities and encouraged them with connections through the community and other resources that, hey, one person can make a difference in this space, because it's that early where you can be the one voice the local politician is hearing from on cannabis topics, because no one else is there. At least maybe it's a little different out here, but on the East Coast it's still fairly in the beginning stages. So all politics are local. So if you're there at the community board or with your electeds and you're there every week or every month and they get to know you as the person who knows about cannabis, eventually they're going to start paying attention to you, and now you have their ear, and now you have a little bit of influence. So I would say for me the biggest thing was getting others involved, because if you have more leaders in the space, everyone's better off. And then the second thing I would say is, and I've learned that politicians and they feel the pressure of media and PR, especially our current commander-in-chief. So I've been fortunate to be in the media capital of the world and build relationships with journalists. And if there's an opportunity to put pressure on a Governor Cuomo who maybe isn't doing enough, and you could get some bad PR that he and his office will feel the heat, then I think that's a step in the right direction. But I would defer to Joe about manipulating the media to put pressure on the electeds.
How do we get those stories in the media? I've been working on that for many years as well, and it's not always been easy. We had to really work hard to get some of these stories told, not just told, but told in the right way. So that's always been tricky. I felt like we started getting on the right side of media bias around 2009, because before that they would just make pot puns every time they did a pot story. So, but getting those stories in the media is really important. But how do you do that? Joe, can you give us some advice?
Well, there's really no magic sauce for that, other than the one, to back up 1 second, when Mary was talking about. And Mary's heard me say this, when it comes to political activism, and I've been talking to groups like you for years about this, and with apologies, and fortunately it's beginning to change, and that's really important. But people would say, I would say to groups, I say, the good news is 130, 140 million Americans have used cannabis at some point in their life. And the bad news is none of them vote and none of them give money. And until that changes, nothing's going to change. As far as the media is concerned, here's my kind of self-criticism. Going back to what I said about it being a movement, it's not how many hits you get in the media, it's who's doing the hitting. And having people who are, for example, in the current climate, perceived as being progressives or on the left or whatever, people you would expect to be in favor of cannabis legalization, that really doesn't do anything for you in the current climate. Let's go out and find one, I think a great untapped resource are the athletes. That's the untold story here. How you now have the national sports leagues almost unanimous in calling for some kind of legalization.
Marvin Washington.
Having, the best athletes on the world, in the world on CNN talking about it, that leaves a mark. And look, people are out there, and it's not there's no magic bullet, but we've got to pull them out and get them on the air. You give me a professional athlete who's willing to go on CNN, I get paid to do this. Believe me, I can have them on tomorrow.
Do we have any questions for this great panel? No questions.
Late in the day.
Yes, I know. Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody for everything you're doing. Oh, come on up.
There's questions out there.
Hey guys, I think it was Mieko and Juhlzie, right? In the middle?
I'm sorry, yes?
Mieko and Juhlzie? Juhlzie,
Nurse Juhlzie, yeah.
Nurse Juhlzie and
Jules,
Mieko.
J-U-H-L-Z.
So, from your perspective, you know, we've been talking about how to communicate with politicians, but we also need to educate doctors and medical staff, right? So a lot of ways they can become the advocates when we're not there. You know, this could be like a whole lot of treatments and, you know, a whole new method of treating their patients that is not typically available to them across the U.S. So what's the most effective message we can use to get to doctors, to medical staff in general, from both of your perspectives?
All right, so we want to repeat that question. I'll let Mary do that.
In trying to educate doctors and health professionals, what's the most effective message that you found to get through to them, to really start to get them, working with cannabis? I know that, and I don't want to jump in the middle of this question, but I will say I talked to doctors as well, and they've told me that the hardest part for them is writing a prescription, because in their brain that is telling a patient to take a certain type of thing this many times a day, and dosing is difficult for a doctor. So they don't understand how to prescribe marijuana, so that's what I've run into. I imagine that you run into
it comes
something
down
very
to
similar.
education, Mary,
Right.
and that was a very excellent question. Doctors are under the American Medical Association. They have a lot of more restrictions. Being a Schedule I drug, it's taboo. Bonnie Goldstein, she's a pediatric neurologist out of California. I'm sure you know her. I love her to death. The last Patients at a Time conference we had, I was having a conversation with her, and I said, well, I know how to get the nurses on board, but you doctors are just, what's going on with you guys? And she goes, well, one, they're either going to get it or they're not going to get it. And you as a patient have a right that just because they were not taught that we have a 12th body system called the endocannabinoid system. They don't teach it in med school. Dr. David Allen, he was a neurologist and a cardiac surgeon, vascular surgeon, did a study where he took all over the country and surveyed all the medical schools, top medical schools, and asked them some very specific questions, and none of them even an endocannabinoid what? Another one goes, oh, we can't talk about that, it's a Schedule I drug, click. I mean, the responses were just insanely ridiculous. So there's a lack of education. There are organizations out there that do train doctors and give them CMEs, and they're doing phenomenal. If you guys have questions about that, do ask me about it. And that's where, as a nurse, we've stepped into the space, and I kind of like went out, because Nevada nurses didn't think like me. They're like, you're committing career suicide. I'm like, perhaps, but I'm going over this way anyways. And so we are actually educating on what, if we, through the doctors, going back to your question, if we as nurses start understanding it and know about it, and we start challenging them on it, they're either going to go with it or they're not going to go with it. And if they go with it, great. Let's learn about the endocannabinoid system. If they don't get it, I usually tell my patients it's time to find a new doctor, because they didn't always believe in hand washing either. I have a nurse in this room right now. He used to have his hands in the cavity because I remember not even using gloves, and how can we not use gloves now? So ideas don't always come easy. A lot of people who have won Nobel Prizes have been laughed off the stage the very year before on that very thing. So I always say, challenge your doctors. They don't know what they don't know. I didn't know. You didn't know. We all didn't know, but we know now. So education is the key on that.
And I'm happy to say next week I will be speaking at the Nurses Oncology Conference. And I want to tell you the push has been from the patients. So the patients are going to the physicians and saying, whether you agree or not, this is what I'm going to do. And I think it's propelled physicians to want to reach out. And as an educational director in the area that I live in Orange County, now I'm seeing more physicians and social workers walk into my office. And so they're definitely feeling the push of the patients. And for the very first time, I will be speaking at an oncology conference about cannabis. And so it's come a long way, but as patients, we need to be proactive.
There was another question.
My question is kind of similar. Is there an educational resource to send veterinarians to for people that have pets that are interested in getting their pets off of like phenobarbital and things like that? Because I've been in search, and most vets that I've come across, they don't know much about it. They say there's not enough research, or they just don't even know where to go to find out.
So one of the companies that I work with is Vet CBD. Contact Vet CBD and they'll go ahead and provide you with those resources.
Well, it was interesting, going back in California, there was a doctor that was a veterinarian who was really into the research and started utilizing it and started trying to incorporate it, but they immediately just put the hex on it. It's quite interesting. But there are a lot of companies, like you said, Vet CBD. I know Treat Well with Allison. She's up in Northern California. I adore her. I had to speak to a group in Florida, and they all were equestrian people, and I happened to find this one study, this self-study that was published on one, it was on utilizing cannabis in their horses and actually having success stories on that. And that was just one isolated case, but there's so much room for so much to happen in the veterinary world. It's incredible. Because did you know all mammals have an endocannabinoid system? I'll say that again. All mammals have an endocannabinoid system. And that includes our cats, our dogs,
Bugs have
our
them
pets.
too.
And what?
Bugs have them too.
Bugs, yes. So it's an amazing plant. And cannabis isn't the only plant that you can get cannabinoids from. It just happens to be the most resourceful and juiciest plant out there, and has so many varieties. It's amazing.
Well, thank you guys so much. You guys are so awesome, and you guys are all activists too, and please keep going, keep carrying the torch. We need you all, and thank you all so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Keep it going, guys. Please keep it going. That was an amazing panel. Mary, Joe, Mieko, Juhlzie, and Mike, thank you guys so much. Very much appreciate that. We've got one final program to give you guys at 5 o'clock. Bud Tender Fight Club presents Your Career in Cannabis. So you won't want to leave. Just be sure to stick around for that, and we'll welcome you back for that at 5 o'clock. So we'll see you again shortly. Thank you so much.